What if the official record of someone's life simply doesn't add up? Not in an obvious way, not in a way that immediately signals something is wrong, but in the quiet, unsettling way where small details refuse to align, where the more closely you look, the less certain everything becomes. There's a woman whose story has been documented, verified, and filed away in historical archives. Her name appears in records from 1953. Her photograph exists. People who knew her gave statements that were recorded and preserved. On the surface, everything looks exactly as it should. The paperwork is in order. The timeline appears to follow a logical sequence. And for decades, no one gave it a second look. But this is where it becomes unclear. When researchers returned to this case years later, not looking for problems, simply reviewing the material, they found that certain details did not sit comfortably alongside each other. The dates in one document did not match the dates in another. The locations described in one record conflicted quietly with details found elsewhere. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately look like an error. Just small points of misalignment that accumulated the longer the record was examined. At first, it seems normal. Historical records often contain minor inconsistencies. Administrative errors happen. Files get misfiled. Details get recorded imprecisely. These are well-known problems with documents from that era, and researchers are generally careful not to read too much into them. But there is a problem. The inconsistencies in this particular case do not appear randomly. They cluster around specific points in her story. The same periods, the same types of documents, the same categories of information. That kind of pattern is harder to explain away as simple administrative carelessness. Her story, as told by official sources, is straightforward. A woman, a year, a place, events that followed one after another without apparent complication. Nothing about it was supposed to raise questions. And yet, the questions exist. They are not loud questions. They are not the kind that come with dramatic evidence or clear accusations. They are the quieter kind. The kind that emerge when you simply ask whether the details, taken together, fully support the account being presented. And in this case, they do not fully match. This raises a simple but uncomfortable question. If the story is as clear and settled as it appears, why do the details keep shifting depending on which document you are reading? Why does the same event get recorded differently in different places? That is where this investigation begins, not with answers, but with the recognition that the record itself is not as stable as it first appeared. According to the accepted historical account, her story begins in a specific place and follows a well-documented path. Records from 1953 show her name attached to an address, a profession, and a set of relationships that appear verifiable on the surface. This is not unusual for the period. Administrative systems at the time were designed to create exactly this kind of paper trail. A connected sequence of documents that together build a picture of a person's life and movements. And on first review, her record does exactly that. It presents a coherent picture. A name, a location, a role, a set of connections that link one document to the next in a way that appears organized and complete. Officials at the time had no reason to question any of it. The paperwork was processed through the appropriate channels. The dates were stamped by the relevant officers. The people involved gave their accounts, and those accounts were recorded and filed. In their view, the case was straightforward. There was no flag raised, no review ordered, no second look taken. The record was accepted as accurate, and that was where the matter rested for many years. But this is where it becomes unclear. When independent researchers began cross-referencing those same records decades later, not with suspicion, but simply as part of a broader historical review, they found something unexpected. At least two separate documents, both officially filed, both carrying the appropriate markings, listed different details for the same events. The differences were not large. They were not the kind of contradictions that would immediately signal a serious problem. But they were there, and they were specific enough to suggest that something, at some point, had not been recorded correctly. One document places her in a particular city during a specific month of 1953. Another document, filed by a different office during the same general period, suggests she was somewhere else entirely at that time. Both records appear authentic. Both carry official stamps from recognized institutions, and neither has ever been fully reconciled with the other. This raises questions. If both documents are genuine, then at least one of them contains incorrect information. And if one contains incorrect information, the question becomes, how did that happen? and which account is the accurate one. At first, it seems normal. Administrative errors were common in that era. A detail entered incorrectly, a date misread, a location recorded imprecisely. These things happened regularly and often meant very little. But there's a problem. This particular discrepancy does not appear just once. It surfaces several times, across different files, from different offices. And that is where a simple administrative explanation starts to feel insufficient. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to step back and look at the broader context of that period. The early 1950s were not a simple time for record-keeping. Across many regions, administrative systems were being rebuilt from the ground up. Some were being reorganized following years of disruption. Others were being deliberately restructured to reflect new political and institutional arrangements. This created an environment where documentation was inconsistent, not just in quality, but in completeness. Historians who work with records from this era regularly encounter files that are incomplete, misfiled, or internally contradictory. That context is important to keep in mind. It means that imperfect records from 1953 are not automatically suspicious. But it also means that when a record appears unusually incomplete, it is worth asking why. Her background, as described in official sources, follows what appears to be a typical pattern for someone of her described circumstances. Modest origins, a limited but seemingly verifiable set of connections, a life that, by most outward measures, would not attract unusual attention or require any special scrutiny. And this is exactly how her file reads, quietly, ordinarily, without anything that immediately signals a problem. But this is where it becomes unclear. Several researchers who examined her background documentation noted that her file is noticeably thinner than comparable records from the same period and the same administrative system. Most individuals processed through similar channels left behind a broader paper trail. Family registration records, local community mentions, references in neighborhood or institutional logs, small but consistent traces that together confirm a person's presence and history in a given place and time. Hers are remarkably sparse. The connections that do exist in her file are limited in number and narrow in scope. They confirm some basic facts but do not build the kind of layered background that most similar records produce naturally over time. At first, it seems normal. Records from this period were frequently incomplete, and losses of documentation were not uncommon. But there is a problem. The thinness of her file is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated specifically in the areas that would typically provide the most grounding for a person's identity and history. The parts that are missing are precisely the parts that would be most useful for independent verification. This raises a quiet but persistent question. Is the incompleteness of her background record simply the result of circumstance, lost files, imperfect systems, the general disorder of the period? Or does it point to something else entirely? At this stage, there is no clear answer, only the observation that the gaps in her record are not random. And that observation, on its own, is enough to keep the question open. By the midpoint of reviewing her documented history, certain inconsistencies begin to surface more clearly. They are not hidden. They are sitting inside the official record, visible to anyone who takes the time to compare one document against another. And that, in itself, is worth noting. These are not details that required special access or unusual investigative methods to uncover. They were found simply by placing documents side by side and reading them carefully. Which raises a natural question. If they are this visible to outside researchers, why were they never addressed by the institutions that originally handled the case? The first inconsistency involves timing. According to official records, she completed a specific process in the spring of 1953. The primary paperwork supports this date clearly, but a secondary source, a logbook from a connected institution that was cross-referenced during a later review, lists a processing date that falls nearly 4 months earlier. 4 months is not a small difference. It is not the kind of gap that results from a clerical misread or a date entered in the wrong format. If the earlier date recorded in the logbook is accurate, it changes the sequence of events that followed. It means that certain things happened before other things, in a different order than the official account presents. And if the order is different, then at least part of the accepted explanation needs to be looked at again. But this is where it becomes unclear. Neither date has been formally disputed. Neither institution has issued a correction. Both versions of the timeline continue to exist in the record, unresolved. The second inconsistency involves a name, or more precisely, a variation of a name. Across 3 separate documents, her name appears in slightly different forms. The differences are small. A letter changed here. A spelling adjusted there. At first, it seems normal. Name variations were genuinely common in administrative records from this period, particularly where handwriting was transcribed or details were entered by multiple clerks across different offices. But there's a problem. One of those name variations does not appear in a document connected to her case. It appears in a file belonging to a completely different administrative category, one that, by its classification, should have had no connection to her record at all. How a version of her name ended up in that file has never been explained. There is no transfer note, no cross-reference entry, no administrative reason on record for why that name appears where it does. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. A name variation in the wrong file is either a coincidence or it is something else. At this point, no one has formally determined which. As the investigation moves forward, the picture becomes harder to simplify. Each layer that gets examined introduces a new detail that does not fit cleanly into the official account. And at a certain point, the accumulation of those details becomes difficult to set aside. This chapter focuses on one specific discovery, not because it proves anything on its own, but because it introduces a dimension to her case that had not appeared in any of the earlier documentation. And the circumstances surrounding it raise questions that have not been adequately addressed. There is a document, referenced in at least 2 separate research papers written by independent investigators, that appears to have been originally filed in direct connection with her case. At some point in the late 1960s, roughly 15 years after the events it relates to, this document was moved to a different archive category. The move was not recorded in any transfer log. There is no notation explaining why it was relocated, who authorized the transfer, or what criteria were used to place it in its new location. It was simply found, by a researcher conducting a separate review, sitting in a category that did not match its original classification. At first, it seems normal. Archival shifts happen for routine reasons. Files get misfiled. Reorganization projects move documents in batches, sometimes without complete records of each individual transfer. These are well-documented limitations of archive management from that period. But there's a problem. This particular document was not empty of significance. It contained a specific detail that had not appeared anywhere else in her official file, a reference to what researchers have described as a second identity marker. Not a second name in the conventional sense, more of an alternate descriptor, written in the administrative shorthand of the time, that would have carried a recognized meaning within the system that produced it. What that meaning was remains unclear. The language used was specific to a particular classification framework, and interpretations of it have varied among the researchers who examined it. Some believe it was nothing more than a clerical placeholder, a temporary notation that was never meant to carry lasting significance. Others suggest it points to a selective classification system that was applied to certain individuals during that period for reasons that were not always made explicit in the public record. Neither reading has been confirmed, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The document itself has not been made fully available for independent review. Researchers have accessed it only partially, through references and summaries in other files. The complete original remains restricted, which means the detail at the center of this question, the second identity marker, cannot yet be fully examined by anyone outside the institution that holds it. What makes this case more difficult to dismiss is not any single inconsistency. Taken alone, each irregularity that has surfaced so far carries a possible explanation: an administrative error, a misfiled document, a name variation caused by inconsistent transcription practices, a date difference produced by an outdated or poorly maintained logging system. Any one of these, on its own, would be easy to set aside. Historians encounter this kind of thing regularly when working with records from that period. A single unexplained detail is rarely enough to call an official account into question. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the irregularities in her case do not appear alone. They appear together, and when they are examined as a group rather than individually, something shifts in how they read. When you step back and look at all of them at once, a recognizable pattern begins to form. The gaps in her record do not appear randomly across different document types. They appear consistently in the same categories of files, specifically the kinds of records that would normally provide the strongest independent verification of a person's identity and movements. The inconsistencies also cluster around the same time periods. Researchers have noted that the contradictions concentrate most heavily in the first and third quarters of 1953. That is not an even distribution across the year. It is a concentration. And concentrations, in investigative terms, tend to mean something, even when that meaning is not yet clear. Additionally, the secondary records that contradict the primary account share another common feature. They all originate from offices that operated with a degree of separation from the main administrative body responsible for managing her case. They were not produced by the same institution. They were produced by connected but distinct bodies, which makes simple internal error a less comfortable explanation. This pattern has been noted by more than one researcher, and the detail that carries particular weight is this: those researchers were working independently. They did not have access to each other's findings at the time they conducted their respective investigations. They were examining different portions of the same record, through different channels, at different points in time, and yet they arrived at similar observations. When separate investigators, approaching a case from different directions and without coordination, identify the same structural pattern in the evidence, that is worth paying attention to. It does not confirm anything deliberate. It does not prove that information was intentionally obscured or that the official account was constructed to mislead. But it does suggest that the inconsistencies in a record are not the product of random chance. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because random errors do not tend to follow a pattern. Deliberate ones sometimes do. Not everyone who has studied this case agrees on what the evidence suggests. This is important to acknowledge. When researchers examine the same set of documents and arrive at different conclusions, it does not automatically mean that one side is wrong and the other is right. It means the evidence itself is open to interpretation. And in this case, the interpretations vary, not wildly, but in ways that matter. Each perspective is grounded in something real. Each one draws from the same underlying record, and yet they point in noticeably different directions. The first position, held by one group of researchers, is that the inconsistencies are the result of systemic failures in record-keeping during a turbulent and disorganized administrative period. Their argument is straightforward. The 1950s produced thousands of flawed records across many different institutions and regions. Incomplete files, contradictory dates, name variations, misfiled documents. These were not rare exceptions. They were common features of an administrative environment that was under significant pressure. From this perspective, her case is not unusual. It is simply an example of how unreliable documentation from that era can be when examined closely. This is a reasonable position. It is supported by broad historical evidence, and it does not require any assumption beyond what is already well established about record-keeping conditions of the time. At first, it seems like the most logical place to land, but others disagree, not dramatically, but specifically. A second group of researchers accepts that administrative errors were common, but argues that this particular pattern of inconsistencies goes beyond what routine disorder would typically produce. Their reasoning centers on where the contradictions appear. The most significant discrepancies in her record are not found in minor background documents or peripheral files. They are found in records that would have passed through multiple review stages before being finalized, documents that were designed to be checked, verified, and approved before entry into the official archive. This raises questions. If these documents went through proper review, how did significant inconsistencies survive that process undetected? It doesn't fully make sense as a simple oversight. A third perspective approaches the case differently. Some researchers have suggested that her documented identity may have been deliberately constructed or quietly adjusted at some point, not for reasons that are dramatic or immediately obvious, but for the kind of routine administrative purposes that were more common during that period than the public record typically reflects. This is the least confirmed of the three positions, but it is not without a basis in the evidence. None of these interpretations can be validated with what is currently available. Some believe one version, others disagree, and the documents themselves remain open to more than one honest reading. After looking at all of this carefully, the records, the inconsistencies, the patterns, and the competing explanations, one thing becomes clear. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, simply an observation that is difficult to argue against. The official story of 1953 is not as settled as it appears. And that matters. Not because an unsettled story is automatically a false one, but because a story that presents itself as complete and verified should be able to withstand basic scrutiny. In this case, it does not fully hold up. The closer the record is examined, the more questions it produces rather than answers. To be precise about what this means, and what it does not mean, this investigation has not established that the official account is fabricated. It has not demonstrated that someone deliberately concealed information, manipulated documents, or constructed a false identity. Those are strong claims, and the available evidence does not support them with enough consistency to state them with confidence. What the evidence does support is a narrower but still significant observation. The documentation leaves more open than it closes. The date questions remain unresolved. The name variation found in the unconnected file has never been formally explained. The document that was quietly relocated in the late 1960s still sits in an archive category that does not match its original classification. And the pattern of inconsistencies, identified independently by researchers working across different decades, has never received a formal response from the institutions that hold the primary records. But this is where it becomes unclear. Silence from an institution does not confirm wrongdoing, but it also does not resolve the questions that have been raised. What was she doing in 1953? Where was she, exactly, during the periods where two official documents place her in two different locations? Why do multiple records, each carrying official markings, disagree on details that should be straightforward to verify? These are not complicated questions. They do not require access to classified material or specialized knowledge to understand. They are the basic questions that any careful review of a historical record would ask. And decades later, they remain without clear answers. Some cases close neatly over time. Evidence accumulates from different directions. Explanations converge. The record gradually becomes more complete and more coherent. This is not one of those cases. The record around her story has remained open, not because researchers stopped looking, but because the documents themselves do not resolve into a single consistent account. Her story, as it stands in the official record, raises questions it does not answer. And perhaps that, on its own, is the most significant thing this investigation has found.